Hi guys, welcome to this tutorial. Looking in this session at Macbeth, looking at the 2018 AQA paper. Going to look at the question itself, the task, approaching the extract, and then show you an example of a high grade part of a response that I've produced. If you were watching the last tutorial, I can only apologise for my dog Henry having a full-scale savage wolf bark attack because the postman had just arrived. So yeah, I am here working from home because of the coronavirus situation. So I hope you're all really safe and looking after yourselves, guys. And I know that you'll be really worried, and it's a really stressful time anyway, and that this really isn't helping. So hopefully, just having access to some video tutorials and things from home might help. Okay, so the 2018 question. It's a bit of a weird one. In many ways. The question to start with seemed okay, but the inclusion of Banquo in this question did make it, like, a lot of students found this quite hard. So the question was, how does Shakespeare present the attitudes of Macbeth and Banquo towards the supernatural? Now, what I'd say is, although the example didn't necessarily give a huge amount of guidance afterwards, is that you don't necessarily need to have an equal balance of Macbeth and Banquo. After all, Banquo is killed off mid-Act 3, and although his ghost appears, obviously in Act 3, Scene 4, it's hard to talk about him in the same way as Macbeth. Clearly you're going to have to mention him because he appears in both of the bullet points, but I would suggest that you don't need to be approaching this as like 50% each, Macbeth and Banquo. So let's have a look at our contextual information. Excuse me. So we're looking at Act 1, Scene 3. As I've said in previous tutorials, if it's Act 1, it's the introduction and establishment of something. Now, we should probably know that this is a fairly key scene because this is where the witches have sort of hung out with Banquo and Macbeth and told them the prophecies. So at this point in the play, after receiving the witches' prophecies, Macbeth and Banquo have just been told that Duncan made Macbeth Thane of Cawdor. So what's important about this when we're thinking about attitudes towards supernatural? Well, one of the key things is that they have shown to be, or they've proven to be accurate. So let me just zoom out a little tiny bit. So they have proven to be accurate, and therefore this has happened sort of immediately after these prophecies, and therefore how are people going to react? They've had this kind of wild prophecy, but actually it's been proven to be have some truth in it. So this is going to therefore feel quite confusing for the characters as they're trying to reconcile these evil, crazy women with the fact that what they've said is in part come true. So let's look at the extract. Banquo begins this extract thinking about the witches, thinking about their motivation, really. And so what I would say here is he kind of weighs up their motivation. And what does Banquo conclude from this? He calls them instruments of darkness, which is an unusual metaphor, but certainly seems to convey the idea that he thinks that they're wicked and evil, but he thinks that they win us to our harm. It's an odd kind of, almost oxymoronical kind of comment, isn't it? Win us, which seems a positive thing, to our harm, but he's basically thinking about them being a malevolent and manipulative force who is doing something out of an evil purpose. So they are manipulating us, they tell us truths, they win us to betray us in deepest consequence. Think about the verb betray. It really has that sense of well, not only the fact that you've kind of lied and deceived people, but that you've taken someone's trust and then you've broken that trust. So it's got not only a supernatural edge to it, but there's also quite a human element here to it, of betrayal. It's a painful sort of process because you've trusted something. So if we had to sum up his attitudes here, to me they are suspicious, they are fairly, I don't even balanced really, but he's not getting swayed. So maybe rather than balanced, actually, he's kind of unswayed by these promises. He's still keeping a fairly cynical perspective, isn't he? And then we look at Macbeth. Now, Macbeth immediately talks in an aside. So think about the staging of this and the structure. An aside is other characters present on the stage, but they can't hear what the character's saying. So really, this always has a sense of being secretive, which already insinuates that Macbeth is having some slightly guilty private thoughts about the witches. Now, he talks about two truths are told. Now, those two truths are that he's Glamis and that he's become Thane of Cawdor. Now, he describes these using two metaphors. He talks about them being happy prologues to the swelling act. These are actually like dramatic or sort of theatre-based metaphors. A prologue comes at the beginning and it kind of gives you an overview of things to come. And the swelling act, the idea of something developing. So he's saying that these two truths, that he's Thane of Glamis, he's Thane of Cawdor, they're just the starting point for bigger and better things to come. So really that tells us that in terms of his attitude towards the supernatural, he thinks that this is fairly beneficial. He talks about the imperial, meaning kind of royal theme. Then he does have a sense of balance, and that's mirrored in the language of cannot. It can't be ill, it can't be good. There's a balance or there's a conflict. He feels like, how can this be a good thing? How can it be bad? Now, he weighs up, if it's bad, why is it giving me success? I'm now Thane of Cawdor. So he sees the supernatural as having really clear advantages to it in that he's got this new promotion. But he is able at this point to think, if this is good, why am I yielding? I think yield's an interesting verb because it means to give in. Why am I giving in to some images in my own head that are making they unfix my hair and they make my heart knock at my ribs? So he's having what we would call a physiological, sort of a physical response to the way he's feeling, and that his hair's standing on end, his heart's beating. So if he's saying, if this is a good thing, why am I having these basically evil and dark thoughts? And he goes on to say, my thought, this is probably the key line in here, my thought, whose murder yet is but fantastical. So yet meaning at the moment. But this really conveys, at the moment it is a fantasy, but ultimately he is considering murder. And we know, because we've studied this in depth, and our teachers have talked to you endlessly about this, that murder in terms of context is the murder of Duncan, and therefore in terms of our context, what he's ultimately considering is betraying his king, his whole country, defying the great chain of being, this idea of God in charge, then kings, and then everyone else. So you've got two really distinct views there, haven't you? One who is suspicious and cynical, one who he does wonder, how can this be a good thing? But ultimately, there's a sense of excitement of what's to come, and equally it motivates him to have these really dark and evil thoughts. Now, I've, a bit like with the 2017 paper, I've just done some brief planning of ideas, of things we might want to mention. And I thought, in terms of attitudes towards the supernatural, Banquo is a bit more slim pickings, but in Act 3, Scene 1, before he goes off for his ride with Fleance, bad times Banquo, he thinks about Macbeth becoming king, and he says, you have it now, Cawdor king, everything. I fear you played most foully for it. His attitude is that getting involved with the witches is something that's foul and evil. He believes that his friend has been corrupted by that influence. But he does think about what Macbeth's gained, and there is therefore a bit of maybe envy or jealousy when he says, may they not be my oracles as well, and set me up in hope. So there is a sense that he's thinking, if it's come true for Macbeth, may it also come true for me. And they're really the only bits I would focus in, maybe in one detailed Peel paragraph about Banquo. more interestingly really is Macbeth's response. So we have a couple of different things we could mention. We could talk about Act 2, Scene 1. He thinks about, well, he hallucinates, or does he? Is this actually a supernatural ghostly dagger leading him to Duncan? But is this a dagger? If this is a hallucination, if it's supernatural, the reality is he says, "Come, let me clutch thee." He wants it. He pursues that. Equally, a bit earlier, in Act 1, Scene 3, he does talk, when he first sees the witches, he says, "Stay, you imperfect speakers, and tell me more." Audiences that have been super suspicious or concerned by the fact that he ultimately wanted to talk to them and they're a force of evil. And you could certainly link that to his return in Act 4, Scene 1. He makes the decision to go back and talk to them and find out more information. And actually, when they say to him, "Do you want to talk to us or our masters?" he says, "Yeah, your masters, bring them." His evil escalates because they haven't happened upon him or sought him out. He has now sought those witches out, which is a real escalation of his own evil. We could obviously talk about his reaction to Banquo's ghost in Act 3, Scene 4, the banquet scene. "Never shake thy gory locks at me." And we could look at that his attitude is one of fear and trauma. We could explore the fact that he's the only person that sees this. So we could question and explore whether or not it even was a ghost, or if it was another sort of manifestation of his stress. Is it another hallucination? And then finally, we could talk about the denouement, stuff within Act 5. In Act 5, Scene 5, he talks about he's beginning to doubt them. And but even so, when he sees Macduff, he says, "I bear a charmed life. No man born of woman can hurt me," which is fine until obviously Macduff does reveal that he was born by cesarean. At which point, finally, Macbeth has this realisation that the witches are juggling fiends. And that's a really great image to remember, because it's this idea that they've been juggling, literally. They've been sort of playing with his life. And he realises that, but far too late, because this comes just before his death. So you've got a number of things that you could talk about there, and all of these kind of cover the beginning, middle, and end, or exposition and climax and denouement of the play. Okay, in my best, here's one I made earlier. So in this instance, because I know lots of you prefer an approach where you start with the extract, so that's what I've done here. In the extract, Shakespeare presents Macbeth and Banquo as having distinctly different attitudes towards the witches. Because you're asked about both characters, I think it's important to address that idea early on. Banquo feels cautious, reflecting the Jacobean fear. Reflecting the Jacobean fear and mistrust I put over of witches. So in terms of here, we've got some explicit kind of context going on. I wish I had a different colour pen. So I'm starting off by looking at Banquo, and I'm going to mention this idea of the instruments of darkness. So the metaphor. So we're looking here in terms of assessment objective 2 about language techniques and methods. So the metaphor, instruments of darkness, suggests he believes them to be wholly evil, that they are instruments of a malevolent, even satanic power. He also shows a logical suspicion. Shakespeare's use of the verb betrays suggests that Banquo understands the supernatural is manipulative and vindictive. It will win us to our harm. So using a number of quotes from the extract, so that and betrays. I've also got another technique in there. I'm referencing Shakespeare's use of, so the idea of him as a writer. And just here an embedded quote. So Shakespeare deliberately juxtaposes this cautious fear with Macbeth's excitement and delight. So as soon as we talk about juxtaposition, that's a structural technique. With Macbeth's excitement and delight, foreshadowing his potential to descend into evil depravity. So foreshadowing is another structural device. If it's beneficial to him. The metaphors of... Sorry, I just dropped my pen. The metaphors of happy prologue and swelling act, so we've got some more sense of devices, some more quotes, show that he believes the prophecies are the start of something positive. Macbeth's hamartia, so we remember that hamartia is a fatal flaw that tragic heroes have. For him, it's his ambition, but Macbeth's hamartia, his ambition, is seen in his response, cannot be ill, cannot be good. All of this seems to be balanced. He quickly refers to the fact he is considering a horrid deed, regicide, and admits that his thoughts are now on murder. So we've got context in here. We've got a real explanation of the quotes. We've got more quotations here embedded. Clearly, despite his concerns, the potential for power and status is overriding, highlighting his capacity for evil and creating a foreboding tone. So this sort of section here, this is, you know, again, I talk about evaluation being a really high level skill. In this bit here, I've tried to just weigh up and make my own judgments about this character and how this is creating a particular mood or atmosphere, in this case a tone, what it's really conveying about him as a character. And this is where you're really pushing above grade 7 when you kind of do this kind of element. His reaction is so very different to that of his friend, and the very use of an aside, so we're focusing on that element of structure, reflects his immediate secretive interest in what the supernatural have to offer. Okay, if a student was writing this would be a grade 9 response. I mean, you would need to do more than this. This would be the dealing with the extract part of it. You would need to now kind of go on, obviously, and talk about the rest of the play. So what I would be hoping a student could produce is maybe, so this is kind of one side on the super annoying plain paper, because I forgot the lined paper. Sorry, that's not helpful. So yeah, you can see that I've done, this is kind of one page. My writing's not the smallest, it's not the biggest. Now if a student was doing, you know, another 2 sides like this, they would be near enough full marks realistically. Even if you were able to do another full side of this, I think that you would be, you know, looking to be in a very top grade. It's not about how much you write, although students ask me this a lot, how many sides do I need to do, how many points. It's really about, can you incorporate all of those skills, so quote, technique, Shakespeare's purpose, getting context in there, and being evaluative. Okay, so you've seen kind of how I've dealt with the extract. What I would suggest you do now, as a bit of an independent task, is that you kind of think back over this question. I'll pause it there. Think back over this question and maybe have a go at writing about the rest of the play using the sort of framework that I did. This is obviously a framework for a different question, the Macbeth marriage, but you could use the same sort of structure really to do this, to work on this one now. So I'll just pause that there in case you want to take a picture, or a screen grab. I sounded really old there. I am old. Right, okay, and there's just back the question with a couple of different quotes that you may want to use. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I realise these Macbeth ones are quite long tutorials. Okay, keep safe everyone.